8 of the world's most powerful football nations just made a move inside a closed-door meeting that could end FIFA's 100-year stranglehold on the sport that 3 billion people love. Not in a press conference with cameras and prepared statements. Not in a leaked memo that someone can deny and walk back. Inside a room where UEFA's most powerful executives gathered this week, the nations that collectively control over $100 billion in football revenue sat down and formally discussed building a structure that does not need FIFA to exist at all. And the question they asked in that room is one that FIFA has spent 20 years and enormous amounts of money making sure nobody ever asked out loud. England, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Netherlands, Brazil, Argentina. 8 nations. The 8 nations that generate the overwhelming majority of global football's commercial value, that produce the players the world watches, that fill the stadiums, that drive the television deals, that make the sport what it actually is in the real world rather than on paper in a Zurich boardroom. These 8 sat in a room together and asked a question that changes everything if the answer turns out to be yes. What happens if we simply leave? Now, before I show you everything that was discussed in that room, everything that led to this moment, and most importantly what happens next and why the answer to that last question is going to surprise you, I need you to do one thing right now. Subscribe to Canada Briefs if you are not already here, because we are going to be covering every development in this story as it breaks, and this is a story that is going to move fast. And drop one comment below right now. Do you think these 8 nations actually have the nerve to follow through? Tell me exactly why you think yes or no, because the comment section on this one is going to be genuinely worth reading. Now let us get into it. Because the full picture of what is actually happening here is far bigger, far older, and far more dramatic than any sports headline today is telling you. To understand why 8 of the most powerful nations in world football are sitting in a room asking whether they should leave the organization that governs the sport they dominate, you have to go back to a single morning in May 2015, because that morning is where this story really begins, even though most people who are following the news this week do not realize it. On that morning, Swiss police walked into the Bauer au Lac, one of Zurich's most prestigious 5-star hotels, and arrested 7 senior FIFA officials on corruption charges filed by the United States Department of Justice. 7 men who had been running world football, or profiting enormously from running world football, were walked out of a luxury hotel in Handlebars while their colleagues watched. It was one of the most dramatic moments in the history of sports governance, and for a brief window of time, it created something that had not existed in football for decades. A genuine opening. What most people do not know, and what did not make the sports headlines at the time in anywhere near the detail it deserved, is how close the major European football nations came in the days and weeks following those arrests to simply walking away from FIFA entirely. Not threatening to. Not negotiating. Actually walking. The powerhouse nations of European football came within days of making a break that would have fundamentally restructured world football as we know it. And the reason it did not happen, the reason that opening closed, comes down to one man and a series of decisions he made that tell you everything you need to know about how FIFA actually operates. Miguel Puieres Maduro is a Portuguese jurist, a serious legal scholar and academic, and in the aftermath of the 2015 scandal he was appointed to head FIFA's new independent governance committee. The committee that was supposed to be the proof that FIFA was serious about cleaning itself up. That it was ready to operate with accountability and transparency rather than as the closed, self-serving power structure the corruption arrests had exposed. Maduro took the job seriously. He worked inside the system, examined how it functioned, and reached conclusions that the people running FIFA did not want examined or reached. And he has spoken publicly about what he saw and what it cost him. In Maduro's own telling, what he witnessed was not a governing body that had made mistakes and wanted to correct them. It was a political cartel. Those are not my words and they are not your words. They are the words of the man that FIFA itself hired specifically to reform and clean up the institution, a man with the academic credentials and legal standing to know exactly what a political cartel looks like when he is standing inside one. He described a system with a high concentration of power in the president, a system in which ultimately the president determines who operates at every level of football, from the top of the international structure all the way down. And when Maduro and two of his committee members began doing the work of genuine reform, when they began pushing toward the kind of public accountability that would have made FIFA look and function more like a legitimate governing body and less like a patronage empire, FIFA's president Gianni Infantino fired them. In 2017, after months of conflict, Maduro was removed. The Reform Committee was eliminated. The opening closed, and that brings us to Gianni Infantino, because you cannot understand what is happening in that UEFA meeting room this week without understanding who Infantino is, how he operates, and what the last decade of his leadership has actually produced for the sport he governs. French football journalist Simon Bale, in a new book called FIFA Connection, describes with precision the system that Infantino has built and sustained. It is a system built on a specific and very effective kind of loyalty. FIFA disperses funds to its national associations around the world, and each of those associations receives one vote for FIFA president regardless of size, regardless of contribution to the global game, regardless of anything except the fact of membership. Giant China and tiny Samoa each get one vote. Nations that generate billions in football revenue and nations that are entirely dependent on FIFA funding to sustain their football programs have identical voting weight when it comes to choosing who runs the organization. You do not need a degree in political science to see how that system perpetuates itself. The smaller nations, the ones whose football programs would not function without FIFA's financial support, have every reason to vote for the president who controls that support and every reason to avoid doing anything that might disrupt the flow of it. The large nations, the ones generating all the commercial value, are outvoted by the accumulated votes of dozens of small member associations that have no financial independence from the very institution whose president they are being asked to evaluate. Bale's conclusion is direct and unsentimental. The first criterion of this global body is money, and the president does not even try to hide it. That is the system Infantino has inherited, refined, and now operates from a position of essentially unchallenged authority. And what has that authority produced? Let us look at what just happened at the 2026 World Cup, because it is the clearest possible picture of where FIFA is right now and why the 8 nations meeting this week are moving with urgency that has a specific date attached to it. FIFA generated $9 billion from the 2026 tournament. $9 billion from a single event. Infantino just announced he is running for a third 4-year term as president with 0 opponents. Not one nation, not one association, put forward an alternative candidate. One man, no competition, complete control over the commercial destiny of the sport that 3 billion people watch. While ticket prices reached $11,000 for premium seats. While fans from 4 nations that had qualified for the tournament were banned from attending. While the sport that bills itself as the global game became financially inaccessible to the ordinary supporters in the countries whose teams were actually playing in it. Infantino's response to the anger over ticket pricing was to tell fans to chill. To tell the people who had followed their national teams their entire lives and could not afford to be in the stadium to relax about it. And while all of this was happening, while fans were being priced out and banned and told to chill, Infantino awarded Trump the inaugural FIFA Peace Prize. That sequence of events, the $9 billion, the $11,000 tickets, the banned fans, the unopposed presidential run, the Peace Prize, is not a series of unrelated decisions. It is the visible expression of what a political cartel looks like when it has reached the point where it no longer feels any pressure to pretend otherwise. Fortune magazine's June 2026 cover story framed the situation with a question that cuts right to the heart of it. Has the World Cup made FIFA too big to fail? Think about what that question is actually saying. Too big to fail means too powerful to be held accountable. It means the revenues are large enough and the dependencies are deep enough that the people who might challenge the institution calculate that the cost of challenging it is higher than the cost of tolerating it. For 20 years. That calculation has always come out the same way. The cost of leaving has always seemed too high. Until this week. Because the 8 nations sitting in that UEFA meeting room this week represent something that has not existed in football governance since the 2015 arrests created that brief, closed opening. They represent a combined commercial force that is large enough, independent enough, and self-sufficient enough to make a different calculation. England's Premier League alone generates $4 billion in annual revenue. Add Germany's Bundesliga. Add Spain's La Liga. Add France's Ligue 1 and Italy's Serie A and the commercial weight of the South American giants Argentina and Brazil, nations whose football culture and global supporter base represent something FIFA cannot replicate or replace. Add all of that together and you have a football economy that genuinely does not need FIFA's permission to exist, to operate, to generate revenue, or to stage competitions that the world would watch. The question of whether a breakaway structure could function commercially is not actually a question. It clearly could. The question has always been whether the people with the power to build it had the will to do it. And that question is what makes this week's meeting different from every other time this conversation has been had in private. To understand why the will question matters so much, and why it has historically always been the obstacle rather than the commercial viability, you need to understand how FIFA has managed to prevent this from happening even when the conditions for it were arguably as favorable as they are now. The mechanism is not complicated, but it is effective. FIFA's power over the football ecosystem extends beyond tournaments and trophies. FIFA controls the international registration of players. It controls the calendar that determines when international matches can be played and when clubs must release players for those matches. It controls the framework of rules and sanctions that govern whether a player who participates in an unsanctioned competition can subsequently compete in a FIFA-affiliated one. These are not trivial levers. They are the structural threads that tie every part of professional football together, and FIFA has historically made clear, sometimes explicitly and sometimes through the architecture of the rules themselves, that pulling on those threads without permission comes with consequences. Players who play in competitions not recognized by FIFA risk being banned from FIFA competitions. Clubs that allow them to do so risk sanctions. National associations that support a breakaway risk losing their membership and the access that comes with it. This is the cage, and understanding the cage is essential to understanding why the 8 nations meeting this week are approaching the question the way they are. Because the cage only works if the people inside it believe the bars are stronger than their own combined weight. And what has changed in 2026? What makes this moment genuinely different from 2015 and from every other moment of tension between the major nations and FIFA in the decades before that, is that the commercial reality of world football has reached a point where the 8 nations in that room may have finally concluded that the cage costs more to stay inside than it would cost to break out of it. Let us talk about what a genuine breakaway would actually look like, because the conversation in that room was not simply a philosophical discussion about whether FIFA is good or bad. It was a conversation about mechanics. About what the structure of an alternative organization would need to be, how it would need to function, what problems it would need to solve, and critically, what the path from here to there would require. These are serious and specific questions, and the fact that they are being asked at this level of seriousness, by these specific nations, at this specific moment, is what elevates this from an angry conversation to a structural threat of a kind that FIFA genuinely has not faced before, even in 2015. An alternative governing structure built around the 8 nations in that room would need to address several things to be functional. It would need a framework for player participation that protects players from the kind of dual loyalty conflict that FIFA's current rulebook creates. It would need a competition structure that preserves the things supporters actually care about, the international matches, the tournaments, the moments where national identity and football intersect in the way they do once every 4 years. It would need commercial agreements that give broadcasters and sponsors the certainty they require to commit the kind of money that makes the whole ecosystem viable. None of these are small things, but none of them are impossible things either, and the nations in that room collectively have the legal resources, the commercial relationships, and the institutional knowledge to address all of them if the will is there to do it. The question of the World Cup itself is the largest single practical obstacle, because the World Cup is FIFA's most powerful institutional asset. Not just commercially, though $9 billion in a single tournament speaks for itself, but symbolically, culturally, as the thing that makes FIFA feel indispensable to the global football conversation. A breakaway structure that could not offer an equivalent tournament would be missing something significant. But a breakaway structure built around the 8 most commercially powerful nations in world football with the broadcaster relationships, the sponsor relationships, and the supporter bases they collectively represent, could absolutely build a competing international tournament structure. It would not be the World Cup in the first cycle, or perhaps the second. But it would be the competition that the best players and the biggest nations were participating in, and over time that is what makes something the thing that matters, not the name on the trophy. What Infantino cannot do, and this is the point that makes this week's meeting genuinely significant in a way that his previous responses to breakaway threats were not, is fire the committee that is asking the question this time. In 2017, when Maduro's reform committee got too close to something real, Infantino simply removed them. The lever of institutional control that he used to close the 2015 opening does not exist in the same way when the question is being asked not by a committee he appointed but by England and Germany and Spain and Brazil. You cannot fire England. You cannot remove Germany's vote by firing a governance committee. The 8 nations in that room exist independently of whatever FIFA decides to do with its internal structures, and that changes the political geometry of the situation in a way that is genuinely new. There is also a generational dimension to this that the inside football conversation often misses and that the sports headlines certainly are not capturing. The supporters who are angry about $11,000 tickets and banned fans and an unopposed presidential candidate who tells them to chill are not a fringe. They are the core. They are the people whose emotional investment in football is the source of all the commercial value that makes $9 billion tournaments possible. And that emotional investment is not unconditional. It is built on a relationship between fans and the sport that has been strained, in some cases to breaking point, by exactly the kind of governance that Infantino represents. The nations in that room are not operating in isolation from that reality. They understand that their own commercial power is ultimately grounded in supporter engagement. And supporter engagement is something that FIFA's direction of travel is actively undermining. Now here is what I want to leave you with, because there is one piece of this story that has not yet been publicly discussed in any of the coverage you will find elsewhere today, and it may be the most important piece of all. There is one nation whose position has not been fully accounted for in the analysis of whether this breakaway conversation moves from a closed-door meeting to something that changes football forever. One federation whose decision, when it is made and made public, will function as either the signal that this is real or the pressure valve that releases the tension and lets FIFA survive another cycle. We are covering that story next, and it is the part that will tell you definitively whether what happened in that room this week was the beginning of the end of FIFA's monopoly or the latest in a long series of conversations that went nowhere. Subscribe so you do not miss it when it breaks, because when it breaks, it is going to move fast and you are going to want to have been here from the beginning. Drop your comment below. Do these 8 nations have the nerve to follow through? Tell me exactly why you think what you think. I read every single one.